this is my great pleasure to introduce you a colleague whom maybe I do not have to introduce because maybe everybody knows her, but still it's my pleasure and I will use this opportunity to introduce Ekaterina Pravilova, whom I know for 20 years, more maybe, even so, from St. Petersburg. And Ekaterina is a wonderful friend, but this is not why she's here. Ekaterina is a wonderful, very famous, actually renowned historian of Russian Empire. She is a professor of University of Princeton, and Ekaterina published several important books which got prizes and academic prizes, and I will mention only two of them. This is the book of 2014, A Public Empire, Property and the Quest for the Common Good in Imperial Russia, and her recent book, The Ruble, A Political History, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2023. Without further ado, Katya, the floor is yours, and please welcome Ekaterina.
Thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me, for arranging this conference. It's such a great pleasure to be here, and the conference is fantastic, so congratulations. And my talk was supposed to be actually part of the previous session on memory, so it will continue. We will continue the conversation about truth, memory, violence, victimhood, responsibility, and other issues that I think they are all closely connected under this big umbrella of truth and epistemology. But let me start with a short video, which I hope will play.
What the shit are they up to?
When Putin was a boy, he already knew he wanted to be FSB. He lived in the well, kept a photo of Bergin by his bed. Bergin, who squats in 1920 dirt, gives birth of GRU, later KGB, Godfather. And this boy, Putin, he learns Sambo, rules the yard school by his fist. You see, in Russia, there are two words for truth. Pravda is man's truth. Istina is God's truth. But there is also nepravda, untruth. And this is the weapon the leader uses. Because he knows what they don't. The truth is whatever he says it is.
All right, so thank you so much. Sorry about these technical difficulties. And of course, I showed you a video only because of this last sentence that, in fact, Zhana already quoted in the very beginning, before the beginning of our conference, about the existence of two words for truth in Russian. And if it got into Fargo, the famous TV series, season 2, and the two bandits, Slavic, we don't know who they are exactly, are saying, explaining the reasons, the meaning of Russian civilization through the analogy or the matter of existence through these two truths, we can say that this the existence, the duality of truth has become really a stereotypical portrayal. This is something that really distinguishes Russian civilization, Russian notion of truth from the rest. Because as Zhan also said in the very beginning of this conference, in most other languages there's only one notion of truth, and truth is singular, right? The singular is unique, and it could be no more than one truth. And I think that this understanding of truth also has a very profound influence on the studies of truth that I think, comparing to the studies of lie, are very limited. So this year, for instance, I run a Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University, and I invited 20 free speakers to speak about truth and information, because this is the theme of the Davis Center, and almost 80% of the speakers in the results spoke about lying. So the question is, like, why is lying more attractive as a subject of studies than the truth? And one of the reasons is, again, that this notion of singularity precludes a lot of those, thinking about truth, because truth is singular, as I said, it's unique, it's boring, it's one-dimensional. Whereas when you speak about lie, there are so many words for lying. Just think about how many, like a synonym exists. Lying, deception, what else? Cheating, mendacity, right? Bullshitting, and you can go on and on and on. And lying, the literature on lying is immense, and there is even an Oxford handbook on lying. There is no Oxford handbook on truth. There are multiple books about psychology of lying like children lying, and so on and so forth. There is an inadvertent lie, there is naive lie, and you can go on and on. And of course, there's a big theme about lying in politics, about forgery and authenticity, and again, so many aspects of lying. Whereas when we think about truth, there is not so much of the scholarly interest in it. However, what I'm interested in my research, and this is, again, the notion of truth in multiple, but not the truth as the two bandits we were talking about, not the moral and the factual truth, the East and the Pravda. But I think that this is a very simplistic attitude or interpretation of truth, that I think that truth are multiple. There are multiple notions of truth, and they can coexist even in the same dimensions of morality or factual and objectivity. So in my research, I understand, and I'm going to talk about this in this lecture, truth more like epistemological category, and I assert that truth is as well as objectivity, and this is what Lauren Dasson and Peter Gallagher have written about. They wrote that objectivity has a history. We can also say the same about truth, and truth has a history, and we can also say that Russian truth, multiple have histories, and these histories are, of course, they can exist in different dimensions, in the ideological history of theories, but also what I'm interested more about is history of practices and history of people, how people were trying to establish or find out truth. And of course, there are interesting books written about it. And in my work, I am mostly inspired by these two authors. Is Barbara Shapiro. She's written about probability and certainty in 17th century England, and the studies about relationship between natural science. You can see this is again the studies of the search for objectivity, religion, history, and law, and literature. So in the center of Barbara Shapiro's book is this epistemological changes that are occurring in different spheres of practice, but also research at the same time in one country. And of course, Carla Ginzburg, who's going to talk, who's going to give another keynote address in 2 days, has written a wonderful, brilliant article about Morelli, Freud, and Sherlock Holmes, about the clues of scientific methods. In the article in which he explores the parallel development of those so-called epistemic paradigm in 3 different spheres of activity, which is history of art, forensic research or detective job or work, and of course science. So what I'm going to talk today about is, I'll try to do the same. But unlike Barbara Shapiro and Carla Ginsberg, I'm going to focus more about on the practice or what people were doing to establish, to find out, or to define the parameters of truth in several spheres of life. So the question that I ask is, what drives these simultaneous changes in this epistemic paradigm? With the question that also Barbara Shapiro asked in relation to 17th century England in more like a theoretical, ideological sense. What defines the epistemic value of evidence that are used by people who work simultaneously in various spheres, such as, for instance, law, jurisprudence, or history, historiography, or history of art specifically, or I'm going to talk today about theater. So there's what is common between these two different spheres of activity and what people do to establish or to define parameters of truth, and where can we see similarities and maybe contrasts, and of course the conflicts. And the third question is, what are the sites and the practices of truth seeking? And again, as I said, in my research I primarily focus on court theaters. If I have time today, I will also speak a little bit about museums, but we would not speak about laboratories, but a little bit about scientific research. And I start with Russian legal studies and legal practices, and with jurisprudence, and one particular trial or a series of trials that happened in the beginning of 20th century. But to begin with, let me just very quickly introduce how this epistemology of legal research or legal profession developed throughout the 19th century. Everybody who studies like in Imperial Russia knows that the key, the turning point in this history is the legal reform of 1864. So this reform introduced huge institutional innovation. There's a totally different system of courts. There is a jury courts, the justice of peace. There is the very well-organized system of jurisprudence. There is a boosted development of legal profession. But I think that what is most important for our studies is this epistemological revolution that happened with this legal reform. What exactly changed? Before the reform in the early 19th century, all judges had to operate according to the so-called formal theory of proof. So every proof or a kind of evidence had a particular value, or we can even imagine the numerical value. And the judges, they worked as making this arithmetic for mathematics of truth or non-truth. For instance, there was a murder case, there are some witnesses, and the witnesses who were of a noble origin, they testimony weighed more than the testimony of a serf or a peasant, right? So if there are two witnesses, the conviction is almost inevitable, right? But if there is no witness, testimony is very difficult to convict the person. So the judges, they worked almost, they were supposed to pursue this idea of objectivity, but this objectivity meant precisely the withdrawal of subjectivity. So they were not supposed to use their mind in the assessment of evidence, because that was considered to be as a driver of, again, non-objective treatment of some arbitrariness. What the reform of 1864 did was it introduced actually the opposite system. The system was called the system of intime conviction, or French system intime conviction, which based on the idea that human mind, either trained the judges or the jurors, they all capable of assessing evidence themselves, right? For instance, if a witness speaks, a juror or anyone else can actually assess or decide whether to believe this witness or not. So there's no rule of evidence, there is no legislation, no system that somehow prescribed to judges, to the courts, how to behave or how to make their decisions. And this reform, and then again, as I said, it was a very important epistemological revolution, because it signified a trust in people's mind, right? That everyone can do that, and of course, the judges were entrusted this possibility of the freedom of judgment about evidence. And another thing that I think is also, I'm going to mention because you'll see how it will play out later, all witnesses or victims who were brought to court, they were supposed to speak and repeat all testimonies that had been previously recorded by investigator. Why was it so? Because the judges or the jurors had to see and listen a person reliving the experience of this event, a murder or theft or any kind of other events. So this system was praised in the middle of the 19th century. It's very liberal. It's really the symbol of trust trust in people's minds, intellectual capabilities. But of course, toward the end of the 19th century, things began to change, and in a very conservative end, there was some rules introduced that limit the possibility of the freedom of assessment of evidence. And toward the end of the 19th century, we already see the system is drastically different. That, for instance, the judges or the defense lawyers could not bring any witness to courts. There are some restrictions what questions could be asked. And of course, this was the result of the different development taking place in politics, a growth of nationalism, a growth of conservatism. Also, the new movements, and I can talk more about it, were related to the introduction or the strengthening of requirements toward the taking an oath for all witnesses. So in both the reform, but also the changes that occurred, affected the way, and I'm going to focus on one trial, particularly how the situations of crimes were, or the question of crime, and the questions of truth and untruth, the question of guilt and responsibility were considered by the courts. So I'm focusing on a very particular trial that took place after the Jewish pogrom, which happened in Chisinau, now the capital of Moldova, back then the capital of Bessarabia. This pogrom is considered one of the turning points in the history of modern Jewish society, but also a turning point in the history of modern Russia. Why? Because they were pogroms before, but there had been pogroms before, but these pogroms were never aimed at the extermination of ethnic group. In this case, the pogrom was aimed not only just, it was not a hooliganism attack, it was not a destruction of property, but it was a concrete, like very detailed and precise elimination of one group, attack of one group population against the other. So the result of this pogrom that lasted for 3 days, 49 people were killed, there were hundreds were wounded, and dozens of women were raped. Interestingly, that the government, right after the end of the pogrom, decided to conduct an investigation. And from the very beginning was a decision that there would be a trial. There would be a trial of people who were arrested in the aftermath of the pogrom. There were made arrests. There were 800 people were arrested. Most of them were immediately tried by the Justice of Peace. But 400 people, 400 the participants of the pogrom, the pogromists, they were brought to the massive trial that involved, as I said, like more than 400 defendants and more than 2,000 witnesses. Many of these witnesses were, of course, victims or the survivors of the pogrom. They were also witnesses of the defense. And so this was an unprecedented trial. And we can safely say it was the first atrocity trial that happened in Russia, maybe even in the history of modern Europe at all. There's one, though, thing that changed this, the scale of the events, that the government decided to separate one big trial into multitude and those serialized, so to say, the trial in 22 separate cases. But of course, in the imagination of people and society, was one big trial that involved those like 3,000 people. Because of this enormous response to the pogrom, which became like a global event, the response was, it's difficult to compare. It is somehow comparable to like the events in 2022 when like the whole world was outraged. Of course, there were publication in all newspapers in America and in Europe, and in Russia as well. So in response to the pogrom, a group of lawyers from St. Petersburg, from Kiev, from Odessa, but mostly from St. Petersburg, some of them were Jewish, others were not Jewish, they decided to volunteer to help the survivors and, interestingly, also the defendants in this trial. So 17 people, 70 lawyers, some of them were like star lawyers who were very well paid, were very like really celebrities of legal words. They all went to Chisinau and started collecting evidence, preparing for the trial. And there was a group, they called themselves the young lawyers or the young attorneys because of the ideals, and they were all liberals, and of course, they're a very new method to use. So from the beginning of the trial, it turned out, although, that these lawyers were supposed to represent the Jewish victims as civil plaintiffs, because the Jewish victims, they ask for the compensation for the financial and all kinds of losses. But at the center was that some of them were acted on behalf of the defendants. Why was it so? Because from the beginning of the trial, these lawyers, they had one kind of I don't know, it's not even the point in the agenda, with one conviction that the defendants who were arrested, these 400 people who killed, who raped, like murdered, who beat, who plundered the property of the Jewish families, they were not guilty. There was, like, from the very beginning, they said, these are the wrong people who are sitting on the defendant bench. Who are the guilty are the authorities, those who instigated anti-Semitism, who turned Jews into the people of second sort, and they also had this, like, the theory, the conspiracy theory, that assumed that there was a plot that in the pogrom was the result of the previous organization. So everything they tried to do in the beginning of the trial was to prove the existence of this organization. As a result, when the trial went open in November 1903, it started not with the interviews of the victims, the survivors, but the interviews of the policemen, of the anti-Semitic journalists, and so on and so forth. So those who, like, educated people whom the lawyers held responsible for the pogrom. As a result of that, of course, the judges, who were very kind of, of course, they're appointed judges, there were no jurors, they were very upset, and there were some instructions from St. Petersburg that this, against the politicization of the trial, and there was we can see, like, there was a standoff between those liberal lawyers and the judges. And the result of the standoff, the judges at one point decided just to walk away. So they declared that this court will never find the truth. And the truth is, they said in those, they gave the speeches before leaving the courtroom, and you can see, or probably you cannot see it, it's a little bit too small, but it just summarized the speeches that the truth that we're looking for, what we're seeking, is not the truth about the guilt of these defendants. The truth is, as one of them put it, tell us why we're beaten, right? So why the pogrom happened, why did it take place? Please show us the real reasons for the pogrom, not why this Ivan Pirozhok killed his neighbor, or Galanter, or someone else. So there was a very zoom-out picture of the pogrom, and of course, their understanding of truth was not connected to the primary goal of the whole trial. It was like a bigger, we can say, like, using this, maybe one of those moral notions, a political notion of truth. Interestingly, one of the lawyers compared the pogrom to, like, several, actually, there are several comparisons. I read all of the speeches, compared to a Roman Colosseum, as if there is the audience watching what is going on, and from one side they let the white beast, and from the other they elect the victims. And this is happening. This is not like both of them are, as scholars were saying earlier today, both the perpetrators were also the victims of the same plot that happened. And all of these ideas were also kind of got a support from a very fashionable sociological theory that just appeared at that time in Russia, and this is the theory of the crowd. Gabriel Tard's, his work on the Opinion publique et le foule was just translated in 1902, and it offered a very convenient explanation that people, when they are in the mass, in the collective, in the crowd, they lost the ability to judge and make individual decisions. Therefore, this crowd is as one entity of, like, a beast of many heads. And therefore, every member of the crowd is not responsible for what is happening, because you can only punish a person if this person committed the crime consciously on his own or her own will. So this is not the case. Therefore, this crowd theory sort of also helped them exonerate the pogromists. What was the problem with this explanation, with this notion of truth? Well, the problem was that by the time they decided that this trial or this court is not going to find out the truth, almost they never heard any of the victims who were actually supposed to speak later. So the moment they walked away, this is the moment when just the victims took the stand, they started telling about all of those events that happened during the pogrom, and of course, the notion of what the truth was that my neighbor, whom I know since I was from childhood and from early on, or who worked for me, or if I worked with him when I traded, and he suddenly turned against me and killed my father, killed my son, or my brother. So this, the people who spoke after these liberal lawyers walked away, their truth was to find out the reason and to punish, of course, these pogromists who raped their daughters and so on and so forth. So there's one conundrum that, of course, we can already see this multiplicity of truth. And interesting that these people were on the same side, right? So they were all on the same side because on the other side, they were anti-Semites. What the judges, though, thought, well, the reason why even the trial took place suggested, the fact that there was a trial suggested the government was kind of uncomfortable with the fact of the pogrom itself, that it happened. We can safely assume that the government did not give an order, and of course there is a criminal inactivity of the policemen and the administration, but there was no order and there was no incentive coming from anywhere from administration to commit attack against the Jewish population. Right? So the government was interested in this trial. They wanted the trial to happen. Why? Because they understood that if we don't punish the perpetrators now, the next day they were turning against not the Jewish neighbors, but against, for instance, the wealthy Christian owners of Kishinev or another city. So they had to have this trial, but of course in a very particular way. However, when the judges started listening to the testimonies of the victims and the survivors of the pogrom, something strange happened. Of course, in the first trial, in the Sad, there were 22 of those trials who, by the way, were all conducted behind the closed doors. There was no public coverage of this trial whatsoever. And during the beginning of the first trial, one of the lawyers was secretly transcribing what's going on and sending, smuggling these notes to the Western press, and they were published in the Freie Press and then in the Times and the French newspapers everywhere. But the moment they left, there was as if this spotlight, the lights were switched off. There was no attention, there was no news what's going on. And under the cover of the secrecy, the judges, they continued the business in a very particular way. So, of course, they convicted some of the criminals, but some of the participants of the pogrom. But at the same time, there's so many of them were exonerated. So I read the documents of the investigation materials, but also the protocols of the trials. We can see that sometimes it's unbelievable that the judge could not believe the testimonies of a person who said that I saw this and this person walking into the door, holding an axe or something else, and throwing and hitting a person, beating and doing this and this. And then the judge says, well, these people were in a state of emotional distress. And of course, first of all, in the situation of emotional distress, they couldn't notice. They could confuse the identity of the perpetrators. And of course, they couldn't remember these things. And one after another, we see this, in these protocols of the trials. I came across this explanation of exoneration or acquittal of the pogromists that were wrapped in this very scientific rhetoric. And this scientification, to use the scientification of the exoneration, the pogromists betrayed, it raised my suspicion. So what is this? Is it the lack of empathy? Is it anti-Semitism? Or maybe something else? So at that point, I started kind of trying to dig around and then trying to understand what were exactly the reasons for this attitude. And we can say that all of this, there was anti-Semitism, there was also a class snobism toward these people who mostly were very poor, of the low-class origin. But there was one thing that really also affected the attitude to witness testimonies. And this reason is that at that time, of the late 19th century, early 1900s, if you think about the history of truth, trust is like a pendulum which goes in different directions. When in 1864, the beginning of the legal reform, there is a whole trust, right, to the judges, also to the witnesses. Now, Russian society was in a situation of total distrust, skepticism. And the reason of this skepticism is political, but also, strangely enough, intellectual and scientific. So early 1900s, I mentioned already that there's popularity of the theory of Gabriel Tard about crowd, but there's also another theory that comes into like very much into fashion. This is the history or the theory of the psychology of memory. So all across Europe, there are all laboratories open. The people were tested how people can remember, like first perceive, then retain in the memory, and then reproduce the facts. And there are several important studies were made and published in 1902. There was a really bomb almost. There's a publication first in German and in Russian translation of a psychologist. His name was Bern on this psychology of testimonies and the ability, again, the testing ability of people to memorize and reproduce facts that they saw. And in Russia, there was a really agitage around this topic, and among other people, Vladimir Bekhterev, like a famous, like a star celebrity psychiatrist, opened a laboratory where they conducted experiments with memories. And the result of that was a debate, because what they're suggesting, this people were like, actually, everybody lies. Like there is impossible. Like everybody makes mistakes. Even, it's okay to be a liar because this is an inadvertent lie. And people lie constantly, and the only way to establish the truth and people testify. The courts, they bring in an expert. Let's bring in every court. We should bring a psychiatrist who will be able to look at this person and say whether this person is saying truth or not. So, if you compare it to 1864, this presumption, the assumption that every person of healthy mind can decide whether to trust or not, here's just the opposite. Like nobody can figure out, and everybody is a liar, right? So you can only rely on the opinion of the psychiatrist or experts. And there's a lot of this interesting papers there. Some of them are also referring to experiments, and we were published in this collection. It was called «Проблемы психологии, ложь и свидетельские показания», the lie and witness testimonies were published in 1904. That means just in the aftermath or like during, because the trials, the pogrom trials, continued throughout 1803 and 1804. So at the same time, these things are happening. There were people who were kind of pushing against this, and it was Anatoly Kony. This book was also published in 1904, so again, it's the same time. Like first publication is a later publication. He wrote about память и внимание, за воспоминания судебного деятеля, and basing on his own experience, he was saying that, in fact, people are able to remember things, and of course, this is this distrust, and it actually can throw us back into the pre-reform situation when the history in the system, the formal theory of evidence. So this debate is going on, and interestingly, on the sides of this scientific explanation, we often find lawyers who are participating also in this trial in Kishinev. And many of them were Jewish lawyers. And the reason for them to stick to this objectivity, scientific objectivity, because in other situations, in other trials, they say that the Jewish witnesses are often disbelieved. So if we bring science in, we can maybe somehow like restrain the arbitrariness of anti-Semitic judges, right? But here is like what happened exactly in practice in this Kishinev trial, that the judges used the scientific rhetoric to explain why they distrust the victims of the pogrom, right? So this is a conundrum that has really involved a lot of the discussion, a lot of lawyers, and of course, one of the reasons that Kony was saying, like every year, 2 million people in Russia, across Russia, testified in courts as witnesses. How can you put a psychiatrist in every single courtroom? It's impossible. So this is now you need to find a different solution. All right, so I will come back maybe to some of these events of the trial, but now I'm going to shift gears and speak about my second example. And this example is the Moscow Art Theater, and this is again 1903. The theater was founded in 1898. The two figures are, of course, well-known cultural figures. Konstantin Stanislavski, famous as a founder of the system or the method that really defined how the Hollywood developed in the 20th century and in general the theatrical art. and Vladimir Nemirovich Danchenko, a playwright and a co-director of the theater. So the theater, from the very beginning, acquired this reputation, the theater of truth, for several reasons. First, that because they tried to stick in their performance, and the first performances were historical plays that they staged, and Tolstoy's Tsar Fyodor, then the death of Ivan the Terrible, 1898, 1889. And in all of this production, they tried to reproduce historically accurate details of everything, like the clothing. They bring things from the museums. They will buy old clothes to make old fabrics to make costumes because they didn't want the shine of these new fabrics and so on and so forth. So in all respects, it was a very shocking experience because the people were not used to that kind of, I don't like this term in realism, but of course there was the documentary reproduction almost, a documentary reproduction or representation of literary historical text. But there's one thing that really makes it even more unique. This is what they try to experiment with crowd scenes, right? So now it's like nothing surprising, right? Because we're used to Hollywood and the cinema, the crowd scenes are like a commonplace. But this is before, of course, the era of cinema. And in fact, the person who started doing, even in movies, crowd scenes is Sergei Eisenstein, right? So it's even, in this sense, I suspect there is an influence. But here they try to bring on the stage not just the 50 people who will stand, right, representing the people, but like the real crowd. And it was 100 people in Tsar Fyodor, but it's just not about the numbers. Each actress had a role with this little small biography of who this person is. This is a merchant, this is a son of a priest, this is a young girl, what happened to her, what she's talking about to another actor. So there is a little biography for every person because the every actor is supposed to like live this life on the stage, and there's all 100 of them. So just think about it as like, put it in the context of debate about crowd, right? And this is a really sort of a response in a way to the question what crowd is. There is an individuality of every person who is involved. At the same time, the crowd acts as one whole. So this dialectic of the crowd is really important. But all of these experiments, they reached like really pinnacle in 1903 in the production of Julius Caesar. Interestingly, that Stanislavski didn't want to produce it, was Nemirovich Danchenko an idea, and the decision to make this production was made in April 1903. So just, I don't know, probably like, if it's coincidence, a really remarkable coincidence, but in real aftermath of the pogrom in Kishinev. So when they started, so they started preparing during the spring and the summer of 1903, and in the fall was the first performance of Julius Caesar. So what, again, what we saw, of course, I didn't see we have the reviews in the press and also letters from people who attended the trial that they're really in awe from the crowd scenes, because in this performance, Nemirovich Danchenko brought in the seat 436 people, right? And then for everyone, there was a role. Like everyone was playing a particular role in this massive, amazing production. And if you remember the play, or maybe you saw the movie, and this is, of course, Mark Anthony, played by Marlon Brando, who is, by the way, person who brought Stanislavski method to Hollywood. There's a pre-Brando and post-Brando Hollywood. So here is the Mark Anthony addressing the crowd. And if you remember Shakespeare, the Mark Anthony monologue was going on. He speaks about the Caesar's murder, and he speaks in a he starts speaking to the crowd in a very kind of justifying what happened. But by the end of the speech, the crowd is outraged, right? So this manipulation of the crowd by one person. So this, the crowd turns into one single abyss that suddenly turn against the conspirators, and the result is right. So Shakespeare is a genius, but also these people who put it on stage and reproduced this, kind of gave the response to what the crowd is, how it behaves. It's another genius move. And of course, I can, because maybe it's just a coincidence, but in fact, we do have Nemirovich Danchenko notes. We have the regisseurский exemplar, the director's notes, And people who participated in rehearsal, they all say it was a remarkable exploration of the psychology of the crowd. So this rehearsal. So it's of course, there is an undeniable connection between these discussions about the crowd, the collective behavior, the collective guilt, and the power of a manipulator, like a skillful orator, and the speaker, right? So it's the answer to the question of responsibility. But this is not it. And of course, at that point, perhaps it's still unclear how this all connect to the trial that was taking place in Kishinev. And the connection actually pretty direct. Because after almost, so they played this play for several months in Moscow, and then they took it to St. Petersburg during the tour. And this is supposed to be the final performance. Because Stanislavski didn't like, he played Brutus, he played very bad, he didn't have success, and they said, no, we're taking it down. And it was also very expensive, so all those, the stage design was very expensive and very big. So they decided to show it in St. Petersburg and then after that withdraw the production. But before they did this, after this several performances in St. Petersburg, what happened that they invited, or maybe I don't know who was the first. They invited the group of psychiatrists and lawyers to conduct an experiment with memory during the staging of Julius Caesar. Because what the central event of this play is the murder. And so people who attended the production there, after that, there was a publication in newspapers, in St. Petersburg newspapers, with a questionnaire. So the people were asked, so of course about gender, age, education, but also who was the first to deliver the blow? Was it Brutus or Casca or somebody else? What kind of weapon, how the body was positioned, what kind of the furniture was around, so all of these details of the intricate design of the stage we're supposed to remember. And when they received more than 400 answers. People really wrote them back and responded to the questions. They were also asked not to check against the source, means Shakespeare's play. They were totally amazed because, first of all, this is the first experiment with memory of that scale. Because all before the experiments in Europe, 20 people, 30 people, usually school children or sometimes just volunteers. Here's more than 400 participants. And the second, the results showed there's people saw things they were really mind-blowing and never happened. And of course, they made up things totally wrong. And the rate of error was pretty substantial, about 30%. Unfortunately, we don't have the all results because they somehow disappear, but there are many sort of references to these experiments in the literature about memory. And there are many other findings. For instance, it turned out that women who were supposed to be always considered as the liars, more liars than the men, actually their rate of response was actually almost the same, and even men err more than women. So there are many other things that really showed that there was a revelation. And of course, there are many mistakes in this, some imperfection of this experiment, because we can assume that some people who have read or remember the play. But anyway, it was important. How this relates to the Kishinev trial? Interesting, people who participated in this experience on the side of the lawyers were the same lawyers who were just a few months before were in Kishinev. And at the same time, just one participant, one member of this team of young attorney, his name was Alexander Zarudny, he was actually at the same time in Kishinev participating in the subsequent trial. So these trials, they're very linked to this experiment that was taking place in the Moscow Art Theater. And then you will never know, right, how it could happen, St. Petersburg and Kishinev, but the correct connection is direct. And of course, there is the same question of truth that appeared in a discussion around the trial. Interesting that there was not the only one experience. There were many other experiments. There was the same experiments like Moscow Art Theater produced on the Dnie. There was also a murder. There was another experiment, also with the same question: who killed whom and what happened. And in this book, which is the major publication on the memory and the psychology of witnessing, there are 3 experiments that were just conducted only in the Moscow Art Theater. So of course the question is, why was this theater with such a really attractive place for psychologists, forensic psychologists, to conduct the experiments with memory. And the answer is, of course, this, their allegiance to truth, their attempt to present everything in a very documentary manner with things, but also with the way the actors perform. And at that point in 1903, 1904, there was not yet the theory, the famous theory that made Stanislavski summarize. He started summarizing his ideas about what truth is later, about 1907, 1908. But before 2022, my last catch in the archive, I was not able to come back or receive any materials from the archive, the Moscow Art Theater. But I found that there was this little notebook in Stanislavski archive. It's called Pravda. Well, frankly, there was no revelation. He was just recording, an everyday basis, whatever came to his mind about Pravda and some very banal truth about truth, right? It's but of course, it's all related to the idea of artistic performance. And Stanislavski is known for his new techniques of, it's very difficult to summarize it in a few sentences, but very, very briefly, first of all, he claimed that the performance, in every play, what they're doing is not representation. Representation, there is a difference, there is distance. And I remember Oleg's lecture many years ago about icon, right? When he explained that the icon is not representation of God himself, right? So this is the kind of the same idea that what is happening is not representation, because the representation is wrong. It's already something different. So what is happening is the actors, they relive the experiments of this person based on what? He also read a little bit in psychology. He read the works of French psychologist Ribot, emotional memory. There's every actor had to, performing grief, need to remember about a moment of grief in their own life and relive this experience of grief or sadness or joy or something else on stage to be truthful, right? This is the recipe for truth. And for Stanislavski, this is we're making this circle, so to say. He never said objectivity, never used this word, only truth. But also for him, what truth was is he used the Greek term aletheia, which means truth in something which is not forgotten, right? Lether is was the first slide, title of my lecture, is a river of forgetfulness where everything disappears. So you can be the truth is something which is preserved in memory. And I think that this method, how does it really relate to, in many kind of a more theoretical way, to what I just discussed in relation to psychology of memory and people's understanding of truth. Stanislavski and Nemirovich Danchik, they had disagreements. So Nemirovich Danchik, who participated in this Julius Caesar experience, for him, truth was what people remembered, what happened, about facts, about things, right? The events, circumstances. Stanislavski, he was saying that these things are important, but they are only triggers of truth. The people surrounded by things, they're authentic, they would behave authentically, but they are not the content of truth. So for him, what truth was, again, it's not what people remember this. He was saying that he was writing a lot, on that time. When you remember an event, you don't remember things. You can be mistaken and think when it happened, what place, what was wrong, what you were wearing, but you will remember how you felt, right? So this feeling of this every event, there is a kind of emotional memory of your life, which is more durable than anything else. And to think about it, I think it's really this idea of memory, which is not about precision that the judges in Kishinev, also lawyers, were requesting. So can you remember exactly, and there are many cases when the witnesses erred in something oh, my father, the sad investigation, was dragged into the yard. And then during the trial, they said, oh, my father walked away into the yard. Mistake. she's writing, like she's like, therefore this it's inauthentic, like dismissed, person acquitted, right? So these mistakes and in facts were used as against the testimonies of witnesses, many, so especially there are 2 cases of rapes where women, and there's a lot of now written about psychology of rape and how women testify about rape. The idea is often this: the first memory is the correct memory, and if she kind of changes her history, that means that she's lying. And in fact, it's not true, because what psychologists are saying that women, while they're recovering, of course, they start to remember more, right? So it's not about the truthfulness of facts, but the truthfulness of what happened, and also time. It's not like there's the better truth and the worse truth. It doesn't work that way. So it's just to come back to this, Stanislavski, he had this better understanding, which I think we can use, historians, when we work, for instance, with testimonies of people who survived Holocaust or the siege of Leningrad, right, or war in Ukraine. And I spoke to one of historians who now does oral history of the war in Ukraine, and I asked her this question: so what do you think when people they air about the time of the missile attack or something like it? She says it doesn't matter. It doesn't really, because we can check all of these facts. What is important, or is this what people felt and how they survived, how they remember this experience? So this is the Stanislavski. This is how he understood the truth. It's not about remembering things or who held the knife and in what position, but is remembering of what, this emotional or more moral script of the story and of the play. How am I doing with time? Time to throw back, right? All right, so so I actually had the 3rd story, but I think I can skip it. And the 3rd story was, I'll probably say that. Because, even Stanislavski truth wasn't something that people like very much. There's a lot of criticism and, disregard the rod thing, just that. And then you can see that there's a lot of there's a lot of criticism coming from the reviewers, and I was saying, we don't need this truth. And in fact, it's a lie. Why? Because people come to the theater and they expect illusion, that they need to make this gap, right, of themselves. But you kind of eliminate this gap, therefore you deceive the audience. There's a lot of criticism, and of course the most important is coming from Valery Brusev, 1902. There's the article, "Ненужная правда," then it was like, we don't need this, and of course they called it all realism, this truth that is distortion of the notion of art. And so this, this 2 notion of truth, what the art is and the truth and art is one for Brusev, and of course I'm not going to go into his understanding of artistic truth, but Stanislavski's truth was very much contested as all other truth at that time. So the story, the 3rd story, I can just mention it to you, and I actually have an article published on this, is about Ivan Tsvetaev and his museum built in Moscow at the same time. Well, it started early 1890s, but 1904 there was a big fire when half of the museum was burned down with the collection, and there was a museum of plaster casts. So the copies of the world-known sculptures collected all across Europe and the world. And so what is important in Tsvetaev's story, because the debates evolved or unfolded just at the same time as debates around the Moscow theater. What is truth? For him, authenticity was an authenticity of form, of precision. Just forget about, stop worshiping the original. If you can make a copy which is as good as this, it doesn't really matter. And he went as far as even praising some imitation and fakes. For instance, he traveled, just 2 more minutes, he traveled to Berlin, and he saw in the Museum of Bordeaux this statue. And the statue was originally attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, but then it turned out it was actually made in the 19th century, and it's a wax flora. And he wrote to Uvarov, Grafini Uvarov, a letter when he was really totally amazed by the quality of work. He's like, I don't care if it's a fake. He wanted to make a copy of a fake, right, and bring it to Moscow. And so it's like, again, it's a very different attitude toward truth and what is valuable. And of course, his museum was also very much criticized. The reason I wanted to bring it in is I think there is a kind of magic around this, is that when I was in Berlin 2 years ago, I decided, okay, I need to go to the Bodin Museum to see finally this flora. So I went up to the floor of Italian Renaissance sculpture, and I was looking for flora, is no flora, and I see just one sculpture of Italian beautiful girl, and I see Carlo Ginzburg standing next to it and looking at this Italian sculpture. I thought, wow, this is like a coincidence. The museum was totally empty. There was no one around. But then I found flora. It was not on the floor of Italian Renaissance culture, but they have like in the basement, they have like a special room. There's all kinds of, doubtful stuff related to the Nazi history of the museum, but also they put this flora, which is probably fake, so it doesn't deserve to be on the floor with Italian Renaissance sculpture. All right, so I conclude, and with that, like coming back to the ideas of multiplicity of truth, how can we resolve this conundrum, and how can we study this multiplicity of truth? And I like very much, and like, there is one person who is speaking during all his life against the singular truth, was Tolstoy, who understood truth as a process, right? As soon as there is this like a stable truth, it is wrong. So the truth is a process of seeking the truth, and therefore it cannot be unique and singular. Therefore, we have this multiplicity of truth. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer your question. Do we have time, right?
Let's talk, yeah. Katya, thank you very much for a brilliant lecture. And fortunately, we are very lucky that we have half an hour before we end today's session to ask Katya questions and receive your answers. Who wants to start? Yes, please.
I think there is some kind of epistemological difficult question here, and that is, have you been talking about establishing individual guilt, collective guilt, or individual guilts within a collective act? Because this might be three different ways of proving things. The first, the second, and the third. And then you've got a mix of different methods here, and can you maybe distinguish between the three?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, you're right, that because people were committing individual crimes while being also participant of the crowd. And I didn't go into all these details, the technical details of the legislation, but after 1881 pogroms in Russia, the government introduced a special article, 268, which was participation is that we call it skopiще, the crowd. So, and there was a continuation, there's an ethnic or like a violent attack of one population, one group of population against the other based on ethnic, social, or economic hatred. So a person could commit both crimes, being a member of the crowd. Therefore, there was like the punishment wasn't significant, like a few months maybe of jail. But at the same time, when people came specifically to kill a particular person, search for him and kill this person, right? This is murder, right? You cannot say like, I was under the influence of the crowd and I came to look for Strull Ullman and he was hiding in this house and I searched for him and I chased him and I killed him. So this is murder, right? So there could be both, and of course it's what the court was supposed to do is to distinguish between these things and to try murderers for murder, and also to try rapists for rape, and not attribute every act of violence that happened to those, the crowd, which, I think it's not the mutually exclusive situations.
David, please.
Hi, back here. Thanks so much. That was really fascinating. it seems to me, do you think in the end you've arrived at a Heideggerian notion of truth? If so, what do you make of that? If not, how is it different from a Heideggerian notion of truth?
Well, what is my position in relation to truth? Well, you know, I can define is my position as a historian, and it depends on what kind of history I do, and I really align with not maybe. Actually, I do share this attitude. I do share this attitude, and I very much also in line with what Jan Gross wrote about Neighbors, the book about the atrocities in the Polish village of Yevdabne, where he shows that first of all, people killed Jews at their own will without Gestapo's order. This is one thing. And another thing that he said is, I think is really dictum, that our default option when reading the testimonies of the survivors is to believe, right? Because it's when you let doubt in and start doubting, oh, this person is like couldn't be in this place, or this is like when you start, this is it still doesn't eliminate this search for facts, but the default option is supposed to be the option of trusting the testimonies. Yeah, because otherwise we'll end in the wrong place.
Yes, Steve, please.
So I hesitate to push you past imperial history into Soviet history, but it seems like a lot of people may wonder about the newspaper. And of course, the famous phrase "pravde нет pravdy." So,
Yeah.
Is it a shift in a kind of ontology and epistemology in Russia that you have Lenin with dialectical materialism? You could argue it's imported from outside this discourse and creates that new dichotomy of a so-called objective truth in the newspaper that actually is filled with lies. Or perhaps there's something continuous here. So I was just
Right.
curious how you break the historiography.
Yeah, well, if you allow me, I will actually even refer this question to my period and this particular story, because you know I couldn't, of course, tell the story of pogrom entirely, and then started with a lie, with anti-Semitic lies spread through anti-Semitic newspapers edited by a guy called Khrushchevan. They spread the rumors about ritual murder and so on and so forth, but then you know, the problem of the slide was it was indelible, right? People read, and then there was denunciation or refutation that, but they kind of it pushed, it's kind of strengthened this anti-Jewish sentiments in the city. So when the pogrom happened, there was a common conviction among the liberal public: this is a newspaper to blame. So this is this guy who was like primarily responsible for everything that happened. And like there was a 99% of the liberal opinion who thought that this is like the newspaper can actually mobilize a collective society against the other part of society, because the people, there was no anti-Semitism in Kishinev as they thought before that. But then there was one small group of liberals who were saying like, wait a minute, so if you allow this, you know, possibility of a mediocre newspaper changing people's mind, you know, or if you, that the next step would be that we should entrust the government with censorship. So the government, and of course anti-Semitism wasn't a crime, lying wasn't a crime. Nobody could punish this guy for anything. And this was a fact until post-World War II, when what his name, the editor of the Nazis newspaper, was tried, but he wasn't even tried for propaganda. He was just complicit of genocide, right? So they were saying that if you make this step and acknowledge that the word is synonymous with action, the next step that the government would do, they would ban all liberal newspapers. So be careful with, you know. So what is the more important, the freedom of speech or non-freedom of speech? And how can you combat anti-Semitism with what weapon? How can you protect the feeble minds of this, you know, gullible workers who would read about ritual murder and believe in it? Would you like address anyone, or maybe you should just prohibit, or maybe publish a better newspaper that these people will read. So there is a real conundrum of what to do. And then, in fact, this is why perhaps pogrom is such a turning point in many respects, that for the first time I think that this debate about the role of media in shaping public opinion really evolved into like the big problem, because there was a newspaper and there was a result. So do you see this causality or not, and what can we do with that? So as for the Soviet period, well, that's an interesting story, of course, about the truth which is gotten. You can get to this truth through untruth, and this is like using this the movies sort of the juxtaposition of this notion and this power of interpretation, right? So. Well, I think that the Soviet power kind of cultivated to some extent with this practices of misreading or creative reading of newspapers.
We have a line now. We have Kevin, then Simon, and then Klaus.
I really just had a tiny comment to this last question, which is that just in terms of coincidence of dates, almost coincidences. 1902 is when Lenin publishes Что делать, which has his media theory involving the importance of newspapers for mobilizational purposes with regard to political parties. So that there's a short step that you can take from your cases towards Marxist-Leninism.
Yeah, and like
and
people could not be left alone, but because if you believe in the alone, they become trade unionists. They have to guide them.
Yeah.
No, totally. Yes, I agree.
And also just what a brilliant talk. I enjoyed it so much.
Thank you.
Can I echo that last comment? And I'd like to put, if I may, an unfair question, because it really relates to the last example, which you really didn't have time to elaborate.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it would have been multi-led if you had, but to kind of be provocative on that. I mean, clearly the whole relationship between truth and representation of truth, the authenticity of the object, and so on, is an enormous, enormous subject.
Yes.
I mean, almost all surviving classical sculptures are copies of other classical sculptures.
Right.
And the principal purpose of plaster cast collections, which still exist in many places, was academic, and study collections and so on. There is, I mean, Natalia will know this much better than I, but I think it's the Scuola di San Giorgio in Venice, there's an enormous Veronese Last Supper, except that it isn't, because the original was stolen by Napoleon and is in the Louvre, and they're really proud of the astonishingly well-constructed digital version of it in the refectory, which was done in a Madrid studio, which also did the reproductions of the pyramid murals and so on and so on and so on. Anyway, so I just wondered whether this sort of, it seems to me there's a whole different kind of notions of what one means by truth and authenticity in that whole piece, and which I'm sure you're aware of, and I just wondered whether you could say just a couple more words about where you would go with that.
Yeah, I
Very
agree with you. I
tantalizing.
agree with you that, of course, there is not such a connection as between the pogrom and Julius Caesar, with the same people, like really the move just changed the scene from one place to another. Here, I see the connection in the backlash, like to like connections between Stanislavski and Tsvetaev, who I think that in many respects are kind of similar, like in the social profile and the way they thought, and there's a lot of similarities between them. Although Stanislavski wasn't really educated, and of course Tsvetaev is a professor and brilliantly educated. But so this backlash against their version of truth, or they attempt to push against the conventional notion of truth, because what Tsvetaev was saying, he's like saying like suspend your disbelief, like what you see is and trust this vision. It's not about touch, about history and the knowledge that you bring with yourself. If you cannot see the difference, like embrace that, right? So this is a suspension of doubts or disbelief is crucial. And there is a lot of those here. Well, what made the Russian case specific is that they built, so these plaster casts in the early 20th century was a passé. Like in Europe, they are already like hiding them away. It's kind of a little bit embarrassing. And for Stanislav, it was Russia and United States were hunting for this plastic cast, the two nations that they call themselves like a latecomers. And he said, we will overcome this backwardness with the size and scale is scientific authenticity of the collection, because you can never put that all of the original one room, because one is in British Museum, not is in Louvre, but they are connected from the same place. Well, now we can put them all together and reconstruct, create a scientifically authentic collection. It was the scale, the involvement of the Tsar. There's a lot of criticism. How can you bring the imperial family to sort of open the museum, which is full of fakes? There's a lot of that, and how it affects the authenticity of monarchical power. So I think it was a very hotly debated question, and interestingly, that Tsvetaev, in this respect, he was a modernist. He was really innovator, while politically he was a monarchist, and in many other senses, very conservative. So it's really he was playing against conservatism in one respect, and this pushing this new notion of truth, right? And at the same time, again, he relied on this patronage of the imperial family and so on and so forth. So I agree that this story is a little bit stands a little bit away, and of course there's a big debate around it. But I think that this time, this late 19th, early 20th century, is the moment that a lot of the debates happening around truthfulness and authenticity in other areas as well. So it's not only art or jurisprudence, there's also in historiography, or how to treat memoirs, how to treat should we discard all historical sources as presumably unauthentic, the new reading of better. So I think it's a very interesting time when those the turns are happening, this epistemic change.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question, or I would like to ask you to link what you have just told us about truth and these court cases in Russia to the general history of social trust. Because one thing is what the court does and how it tries to establish the truth, but the other thing is what the society thinks about the court. Well, in historiography, and I'm just telling it because I'm also a historian of corruption. Well, there is this idea that state institutions in Eastern Europe had a hard time to create trust in society. Let's say, well, Prussians in the 19th century in the German Reich were sort of more or less convinced that their state officials were performing according to the rules. This was not always the case in other parts of Europe. I was also inspired to ask this question by a German dissertation which was made by Marlene Weck 5 years ago on the YCIE, the Criminal Court on War Crimes in the former Yugoslavia, where she says that, well, that the court did not manage to communicate precisely with the societies it was sort of trying to talk to, because they were trying to establish individual guilt. And they were saying, well, there is no collective guilt, there's only individual guilt, and we're trying to establish it, and this will bring you a social catharsis to these societies. But in the end, it didn't really happen, because the people in the societies, especially in Serbia and Croatia, were saying that biased narratives had entered the proceedings and the very judgments of the court. Right. So can you somehow relate this to your theme?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that in many ways this trial, and very few people know about it, but debates that happen around it really precedes the Milosevic trial. It precedes the Eichmann trial, the famous conundrum around Hannah Arendt's attitude to whether the court in Jerusalem should have brought the witnesses, right, or whether they should have operated only with the written documents, as it was the Nuremberg court. And so, in the Milosevic trial, there was also discontent of people that they didn't listen, the court didn't listen enough of the witness testimonies. But the court relied on written evidence to make more secure conviction. The society is always unhappy. There is no single atrocity trial that doesn't create discontent, or people do not feel revenged or do not feel justice. So there is this one, this is just a one into the long story. Usually the story of atrocity trials start with World War II, but I think that we can really date it back to this 1903, although it was a very quiet trial, so to say. So I do, like in what I write, I look into Milosevic's story a lot because of the parallels, and of course in the Eichmann story, because it actually helps me understand better what was going on there, not to like projecting backwards retrospectively, but to understand what is at stake and how people react to this situation. Yeah.
I also have a question. And oh, yes, please.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Katya. That brilliant and fascinating, suggestive talk. Just wanted to ask you a little bit more about the way in which those epistemic questions and changes relate to the history of jurisprudence in the late Tsarist period and into the Soviet period, thinking of a kind of trajectory leading towards Vyshinsky and the show trials and the idea of the legal system as an instrument of power and class struggle.
Yeah. Well, it really deserves a whole lecture, of course, because this connection between the court and the theater is like many people make this connection, right? Because of because the people behave in courts resemble the theater. I try to push it toward this more epistemological sphere, right? To see are the courts the engine for finding out truth? Are the theater the engine to find out truth? So I kind of put it in a different situation. But answering your question, like the Bolshevik took this analogy like literally, right? So there was the show trials, there were mock trials, like all over the place that were filmed in the 1920s, and there is a book written about it. And so this, of course, all this trial was supposed to be open and propagandistic. So I don't see like direct connection to this particular situation that I described. And of course, if you ever watched there's Loznitsa documentary about Shakhtinskaya Delo, and you can see, of course, this is a short trial, and how everybody reads everything from a paper. Like this is the theater, right? It's not a real trial, right? So it's there are different kinds of trials, and of course these short trials, they were not about justice or finding out the truth, because truth was already known. That there was a script. So there was like a poor theater, or pure theater. There was like a known outcome, and they were just playing the roles as they were written before for them. So, yeah.
Okay, Masha.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. And it got me thinking about the rules which the art theater imposed on the public. Because, before the method was formulated, the public already couldn't participate in the performance. It couldn't upload, it couldn't be late, it has to be silent, etc., etc. So I think it ties up very nicely with this idea of the closed trial, where the public is also kind of excluded and has to watch it from their papers, from the distance. And it's the same with the art theater performances. So I was thinking maybe it's not just the method, the being truthful to some history, but also, the circumstances, this physical kind of setting of the spectacle that ties up with the trial.
Yeah. That's an excellent comment. It exactly reminded me about the role of audience in specifically even in Julius Caesar, that the stage was built in such a way that people were actually part of the crowd. They were supposed to be involved, like feeling themselves of being like listening to Mark Anthony addressing to them. And those elimination of those, either, of course there's I don't know how to reconcile this idea of the fourth wall, what the actor was supposed to feel, but at the same time, the audience was also prescribed how to behave. And I didn't have time to mention one episode, how people reacted to that when they put the stage, Gorky's Дети Солнца. There was one episode, it was a premiere, and it was 1905, during the beginning of the revolution. There were some rumors that there would be maybe an attack of Black Hundreds on the theater. And there was in this play, there was an episode of pogrom. And people thought it was happening for real because there was like fire and the noise, and they ran away. And Stanislavski like, no, come back. Everything is safe. It's not real. But only they made an intermission. Only a third of the audience came back, and after that, because we are kind of spoiled by the movies, and of course but people they felt very eerie perception. They had this very eerie perception of what was going on because it was so unusual, documentary, and also drawing them into what was happening on the stage. Yeah.
Thank you for that. It was really interesting, and I think the kind of consideration of questions of finding truth and attributing responsibility in contexts of mass violence is really interesting for those of us that work on historians of this region, where often we are there is a pressure from the public or from policymakers for us to find a truth or a responsibility that offers a solution. And we know that the more we dig, the more uncertainty we find. And that puts us in a really difficult position in a world where, we're supposed to have more dialogue, public engagement, and so on. But my real question was about the Russianness of these Russian truths and the wider European context. When I'm not working on the Caucasus, I work on the history of the Manchester Guardian, the predecessor of the paper that we all love to hate. And I was thinking about its editor, C.P. Scott's reflection in 1921, comment is free, but facts are sacred, and the kind of reflections that newspaper had in the British context. So how much is this Russian truth, changes in understanding of truth? How much is it part of a pan-European shift or not?
Yeah, well, it's of course it's not. I often get this question when whatever I speak about in the audience of non-Russians. So what is about? Is like a Russian-specific story? It's not, right? So there was what's going on is the Dreyfus trial was just going on at the same time, and of course the story of newspapers and their role in Parole Libre, for instance, in agitating all this history around Dreyfus, it's very similar. As for the understanding of facts and how it relates to the role of media, it's a very interesting question. As I kind of touch upon it when responding to Steve's question, but everybody had different conception of truth. But at that time, I think this idea of that newspapers are about facts didn't exist. And I actually even read in Alexei Suvorin, who was a famously anti-Semitic journalist, he wrote in a letter to Vasily Rozanov, people think that newspapers are about facts. No, it's about opinions. And this is like, if you remember Hannah Arendt, and she writes about the separation of facts and opinions, and then truth and opinions, how this is all happening. So the opinions, this is what they were offering, not the facts, right? And so it's people were looking for facts, and often the pogromists were asked, so why did you do that? Like there was a ritual murder, it's a fact, right? So we kind of use this rhetoric of facts is a proof, right? So it's facts were at the same time contested, very desired, And at the same time, you know, the newspapers were not supposed to be the carriers of fact. And there's one thing that I forgot to mention, but I think it's very important because I understand from the title that Carlo Ginzburg talk will be on the protocols of the elder science. And the first publication of protocols happened just on the eve between the pogrom and the beginning of the trial. It was published in the newspaper Znamya by Krushevan, and actually referred to there was the early version of the protocols. So the story of this famous, like world famous forgery, anti-Semitic forgery, is very much connected. It's tied to the story of the pogrom and the trial itself. Right?
Anybody else? Other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Ivan Chelikov. I'm sociologist of science technology. And as every good researcher has demonstrated, it raises so many questions. And I enjoyed the detail we move from this 64 child to, and then in this in 1993, or this Jewish pogrom. I realized that actually you're studying some historical issue, but it's very actual now in the time of fake news and everything. And also, we, as a sociology of science, or so many decades, are trying to, to see the difference between facts, opinion, meta, facts. And there is a whole frame of reasoning about that, which we should be aware. Because, for example, Luc Boltanski, in his book about criminal novel and construction of modern society, he said that actually in this period between mid-19th century and early 20th century, modern science adopted this frame of modern state adopted the scientific expertise in built institutions. So that's why we have this psychiatrists and other expertise and many other type of expertise like architecture expertise and transport when disaster have. So the scientists came as an expert in the courts. And on the other hand, we have the deeper frame that it is modern idea that truth is something as a state of the art of the, as I say, fact in the modern, but it is not always like this. Because before, in ancient time, facts are something different. And it is not in this demi reality, but it is in the logos, in eidos, who have to be discovered by the logic, by the reasoning, in the digging into the logic, in the reasoning. So it was shifted in the modern time, and which is even more important. Modern time, in this clash between Catholic and Protestant, this mid-17th century, it came modern idea of truth as a truth which is obligatory for everyone. And it is outcome of this atrocity of the 30 Years' War. And this is Stephen Toulmin nicely show how the modern notion of truth emerges. And scientific method, when you can't just escape, say, this is true, no, you have a method to show and logic. And it is very important as a building of stability of society. So now with this old postmodern shaking, and as you say, it's opinion. No, I disagree because honest journalists who are doing investigation, it may be stronger than judge in legal investigation, or even stronger than scientific research. So it depends on how investment made it. And I'm really, how to say, we have to be careful not to easily admit this multiplicity of truth, because it is a way to repeat of atrocity of everyone against everyone, because there is no common ground when we reach consensus. And every society, it needs some solid ground to reach the consensus. Otherwise, we still fail in the. So this is my comment and question.
If I can just briefly respond, because Nicholas the First one's, I think it was him. So he's it was the VAR of the Minister of Public Education. How he defined this in 1850, like Nicholas I, official nationality, in the context. And he said that the truth is something people should believe in. We give them something, like the story of the Russian state. and they should believe in it. Like, no questions. Like, why those historians are trying to dig like new chronicles and facts? It's unnecessary. You should just, this is it. And it eliminates all problem, because if everybody agrees, and like truth is something everybody agrees to believe in, right? We need consensus, and we start believing one thing. But when these historians come, they try to like erase this consensus, and things get wrong. But, and we can see it the same happening in Russia today. It's like there is a truth about World War II or about something else, and we need to have a consensus. So I think it's a very dangerous idea, in my opinion, when truth is understood as agreement about consensus, about believing in certain things. Because when there is no doubt, there is no belief. Like this is this is also about Christianity. A belief is impossible without initial doubt. You need to doubt first to become a believer, right? And otherwise, it doesn't really work that way. But just responding briefly about your expertise, there was this noble idea, or this objectivity, right? Or this illusion that expertise can help and solve all these problems. But we saw how psychiatrists come with the expertise actually don't solve the problem. So there was a reliance of expertise in late 19th century, created a lot of news, conflicts around it, and actually put experts in a very difficult position when sometimes they were saying, like, I don't know the truth. I can tell you, like, the chemical, that this liquid is blood, but I can't tell you that this person killed this person, because this is what everything I can say, that this liquid on this is blood and this is it, right? So they try to limit their power to like scientific facts, not to really claim something else because it was dangerous. So when I said multiplicity of truth is how historians deal with that, because when we look, history of any society can be written as this struggle for fights for different kinds of truth. And when you see this, polyphony of notion of truth, makes it's all history interesting. It doesn't mean that I will stand on any of these positions. My job is just to show this, this is how people arrived to truth and how they understood the roots or the path to a truth.
Thank you, Katya, for a brilliant lecture and for the discussion to all of you who participated in it.